said, but call. immigration laws and investigating transnational criminal activity. Before we discuss your budget request for the upcoming fiscal year, I'd like to take a moment to thank the law enforcement and civilian personnel who play an integral part in carrying out ICE's mission. Enforcement and removal officers, Homeland Security investigators, ICE attorneys, and mission support staff work tirelessly for the American people, despite being told that their agencies should be abolished. And I want to express my sincere gratitude for their efforts in upholding the laws of the land and ensuring our national security. Thank you. It should come as no surprise that I believe the President's budget request falls far short of addressing the immigration crisis facing this country. And while Secretary Mayorkas and the administration won't call it that, it's obvious to the American people that we have an absolute crisis on our hands. This request woefully underfunds the tools your agency needs to carry out its authority and serve the American people. Decreasing detention capacity in the budget by more than $550 million and reducing the average daily detained population by 9,000 is frankly irresponsible and short-sighted. This administration may argue that such a reduction is accounted for in the proposed $4.7 billion contingency slush fund, but we both know that once you take detention beds offline, it's incredibly difficult to gain those losses in a timely manner when they're needed most. You're starting to see an uptick in the migrant encounters as we approach the end of Title 42 on May 11th. And unfortunately, given the failed policies of this administration, we will likely need that capacity. Earlier this year, ICE admitted that it was a shortfall of $485 million, nearly $500 million. The largest shortfall is in custody operations, which provides funding for detention capacity. If you don't have enough money to manage the current detained docket, why would this administration request a 26% reduction in detention capacity? On top of proposing to reduce detention for migrants who have been convicted of crimes or have removal orders, your request also proposes to reduce the alternatives detention program by approximately 95,000 participants, nearly $100 million. Such reduction, coupled with limited funding for transporting migrants, sends a signal that we are not serious about effectively deterring and removing bad actors, including those who have criminal records and are a public safety risk. On a more positive note, I'm pleased to see resources requested for countering fentanyl, human smuggling, and child exploitation within Homeland Security investigations, although I question whether such resources are enough to tackle those challenges. As one of the largest federal investigative agencies with broad transnational and cross-border authority, HSI proves critical time and time again in disrupting and dismantling criminal organizations and people who attempt to exploit our customs and immigration laws. Acting Director Johnson, I look forward to working with you, your staff, and the department throughout the fiscal year 2024 process. ICE's mission is an important one, and I'm hopeful that we can come together to find the innovative solutions to address the challenges that lie ahead. Now, before I turn to our witness for a statement, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Cuellar, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to join you and welcome Mr. Tate Johnson, the acting director of ICE, who's no stranger to this subcommittee. Welcome back, sir, and again, we appreciate your many years of public service and your continued willingness to lead this multifaceted organization. As a federal agency in charge with the enforcement of violations of customs and immigration laws, the breadth of the investigatory and operational work of ICE casts a wide net, including combating transnational criminal organizations, illicit drug trafficking, human trafficking, smuggling networks, and the violations of trade and intellectual property. I look forward in today's discussion of the President's budget request and how this proposal will better enable ICE to fulfill its critical national security mission. One thing I like to note is that in your budget justification materials, you don't mention the word cartel, as my colleagues have pointed out in the previous meeting with the Secretary, but you do reference transnational criminal organizations, which obviously includes cartels. In fact, your budget materials use the phrase transnational criminal over 2,000 times, and the budget request includes investments in personnel and technology to crack down on cartels, including $305 million for the non-intrusive inspections systems in CBP, with a primary focus on fentanyl detection at the ports of entry, an increase of $40 million in ICE for tools to assist in combating human smuggling and illicit drug operations. We certainly want to hear from you about the work that the Homeland Security Investigation, SSI, will what they're doing to increase the government-wide efforts to combat opioid epidemic. As you know, it's hitting all American communities, large and small. As we see from the deaths of these opioids, especially fentanyl, we've had a 7,000-fold increase since 2015. And we'll talk about the numbers because whether it's President Trump, President Obama, President Biden right now, we've seen an increase. And it's not anything that just rose in the last 2 years. So again, it's something that we need to address all together as Americans. Also, I would like to hear a little bit about the administration's attempt to balance its request with the detention capacity for high-risk populations with alternative to detention for low-risk populations. I am concerned with the administration proposal for border contingency fund that rests on the premise that the federal government can immediately contract and execute over $1 billion to provide resources they need after a predefined level of encounters have been realized at the border. The reality is, under this new structure, the funding would not be available until well in the execution of a fiscal year. Specifically for ICE, if enacted, it would reduce the detention bed space by 9,000 spaces and reduce the current number of ATD participants by 189,000. And again, reactive strategies that leave our workforce without resources that they need in real time only ensures that we continue to play defense on the 1-yard line called the U.S. border itself. I certainly want to thank, as the chairman said, the men and women of ICE. We certainly want to make sure that we provide them the resources to look at the work that they do. At the same time, one of the things that we want to do is find that balance between law enforcement at the border, but at the same time respect the rights of the asylum seekers. In particular, I'm sure you're familiar with the LA Times reported last week that there are occasions where asylum seekers are wrongfully removed from the U.S. despite having an active appeal pending before an immigration judge or some other status that would make a deportation premature. So, Director, I know you and I have talked about it, and I look forward to working with you, your interagency partners, to ensure that this doesn't happen. Again, if they're supposed to be here, they're supposed to be here. If they're supposed to be removed, they should be removed. So we need to find that balance. And certainly want to make sure that at ICE that we address issues from meaningful access to counsel, improving contracting at ICE, especially for custody operations, streamlining and automating processes, and certainly want to make sure that you all work with our Executive Office of Immigration Review to make sure that we're working together to address that issues. Those are some of the issues that we'll be looking at, and look forward to your testimony. And again, I appreciate your many years of work with us. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cuellar. Acting Director Johnson, without objection, your full written testimony will be entered into the record. With that in mind, we'd ask you to please summarize your opening statement in 5 minutes. Floor is yours.
Chairman Joyce, Ranking Member Cuellar, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Homeland Security, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Tay Johnson. I am the Deputy Director and Senior Official performing the duties of Director for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE. The mission of ICE is to promote Homeland Security and public safety through the broad enforcement of over 400 federal laws governing border, customs, trade, and immigration. Before I go any further, I would like to thank you for funding recently provided in the FY23 Omnibus to support our people and our mission, particularly additional resources at the southwest border for processing, monitoring, medical care, and transportation. The FY23 funding also supported our officers and special agents by enabling ICE to focus on key initiatives such as executing our counter-opioid strategy to combat fentanyl, providing enhancements to our innovation lab to include cross-cyber technology, and continuing to build on partnerships and task forces related to combating cross-border financial crime. Critical funding was also provided to expand our litigation teams and continue ICE's information technology data modernization, among others. Our FY24 budget embodies a consistent approach in prioritizing for ICE custody those who pose a significant risk, prioritizing low-risk non-citizens for alternatives to detention, and establishing a 2-year emergency Southwest Border Contingency Fund to support border operations and provide greater operational flexibility. The FY24 budget requests new positions and funding for staffing enhancements to better manage the non-detained docket, which has grown from 3 million cases in FY19 to just over 4.7 million cases at the end of FY22 without a commensurate increase in staff. The FY24 budget also requests funding to provide technology investments for credible fear screenings and enhanced access to counsel. It also provides funding for facility costs necessary to accommodate the required staffing growth of our Office of Principal Legal Advisor litigation teams. In FY22, Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, made nearly 37,000 criminal arrests, including 5,000 transnational gang arrests, and seized nearly 21,000 pounds of fentanyl. The FY24 budget prioritizes additional resources and personnel to support the DHS-led Monroe Project, which focuses on illicit drug operations along the southwest border, including fentanyl, which killed over 77,000 Americans last year. The requested funding would also continue development efforts to achieve full operational capability in FY28 for the Repository for Analytics in a Virtual Environment, also known as RAVEN, enabling HSI to better identify and address criminal networks involved in transnational organized crime, terrorism, and other criminality, to include online child sexual exploitation and fentanyl distribution. Finally, the FY24 budget would increase HSI's cyber investigation support, continue to support the HSI-led Center for Countering Human Trafficking, and continue HSI's trend of increasing victim assistance for all victims of HSI investigations. The ICE Mission Support Workforce serves as a critical role in ICE's ability to meet our national security, public safety, and border security missions. Despite the challenges presented by significant workload demands in supporting a 24/7 law enforcement agency, ICE's mission support workforce continues to operate efficiently and in many cases improve operations to meet the needs of the agency. The '24 budget seeks new positions and funding to address capability gaps in the area of human resources, cybersecurity, asset procurement, and body-worn camera implementation, as well as management leadership and career development, among other support programs. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Thank you for your continued support for the dedicated and hardworking workforce of ICE. I am honored and humbled to represent the more than 20,000 dedicated ICE workforce and proud to serve beside them. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We'll now begin with the questions. I'll recognize myself to start. Mr. Johnson, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm concerned with your fiscal 2024 request reduction of approximately $560 million in ICE's base budget to decrease detention bed capacity from an average daily population of 34,000 to 25,000. Firmly believe that an average daily population of 34,000 is already insufficient, and this request simply exacerbates the enforcement challenges that already exist. Yes or no, Mr. Johnson, do you believe that detention is a deterrent to illegal immigration?
I think it can be, yes.
Then why is the administration requesting fewer beds?
So the 25,000, as I understand it, that's in our base budget, and the additional 9,000 beds would be immediately available as part of this contingency plan. When I became aware that there was this possibility that we might have to take beds offline, come October 1, and then there would be some expectation of like quickly bring beds on. I was assured that as long as we are hitting a certain threshold on September 30, that that funding would be immediately made available to ICE. So unless something has changed, it is my understanding that we will not have to take beds offline, only to have to bring them back on.
How many beds are currently inaccessible due to COVID protocols, litigation, cohorting, et cetera? How much have we paid for beds since the beginning of fiscal year 2023 that we aren't able to use due to these aforementioned reasons?
We're using about 73% of our capacity right now, and this is largely, as you described, due to COVID and some of the safeguards put in place by the CDC. We are hopeful that on May 11, when the Title 42 emergency declaration is over, that there will be new CDC guidance that gives us greater flexibility to use more of the beds that we are paying for at our facilities.
So will you commit then to no longer taking beds offline due to COVID reasons after the public health emergency ends on May 11?
I will commit to following whatever the CDC guidance is as it relates to detaining individuals in congregate settings. If CDC completely lifts the requirement and there are no restrictions like pre-COVID, then I will commit to getting back up to 34,000 beds. But it's really dependent on where CDC lands with their new guidance, if there is new guidance.
Secretary Mayorkas said he cannot comply with the Immigration and Nationality Act requirement to detain all eligible migrants. As head of the agency responsible for that, what is required for this administration to comply with the law?
More beds than probably exist in the public sector, and funding that we don't have. I mean, on any given year, even before COVID, we could only detain about 200,000 people a year, maybe in some of the better years up to 250,000 in a given year. So you do have to make tough choices on how to use your resources. And if you're going to dedicate some beds for the southwest border, you're going to have to pick and choose which folks in the interior you choose to focus on. So that is not an entirely new phenomenon for ICE.
Didn't you just say that you're only at 73% capacity?
We are, and that's largely due to COVID today, correct.
What about alternative detentions?
What about it? Is it, what's our capacity?
Are you making full use of that?
We are. I mean, we're trying to get the numbers down a little bit to get into compliance with our FY23 funding. I think the goal was to try to get that down to about 170,000 participants by the end of the fiscal year. But given May 11, we expect that number will likely increase some.
Can you measure or explain to us how you measure the effectiveness of the alternative detention system?
Well, historically, it's been measured by whether or not an individual actually complies with their terms of release, whether they show up at all their ICE appointments and check-ins, whether they allow for the home visits and the like that are required by the ATD program or some participants in the ATD program, and most importantly, whether they show up at court for their hearings as scheduled.
Isn't it true that you stopped monitoring them within 30 days?
Not within 30 days, but it is true that it, just based on current funding levels and the extensive amount of time that it takes an individual to sort of have their case adjudicated before EOR, it is impossible to hold someone or keep someone enrolled in the ATD program for the entire period of their removal proceedings. So right now, I think the average length of stay on ATD is somewhere around a year and a half, 18 months. And as you guys are fully aware, it takes about 3 to 5 years to have an individual's case conclude.
I've exceeded my time, but I would like to recognize Ranking Member Cuellar for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, the administration's plan to end the Title 42 expulsion authority And again, I'm a big believer in Title VIII instead of Title 42, even though I support Title 42. And there are three things that the administration is doing. They did an agreement with Panama and Colombia, number one. Number two, they got the asylum officers. They're going to do some expedited work with Border Patrol facilities. And number three, there's a rule that should come out before May 11th that basically says that if people don't come in, if they come in between ports of entry, they'll be returned and they have to come in through a port and do it, provide an incentive to do it the legal way and not not in between ports. And since I represent a lot of border area, that's important to me that people are not crossing our lands. Number one. Now, I want to see what ICE is doing to do this because I'm concerned about a couple things. Big picture. According to Secretary Fudge's statement that she provided just recently, she says that there are a shortage of almost 7 million affordable housing units. And for every 100 extremely low-income renter, there are only 33 rentals available. So I want to put that outline out there. Now, looking at the top 10 parole notice to report appointments for backlog locations as of April 7, 2023. And as you know, there's the NTR, which is a notice to report to ICE. And then traditionally, we've used the NTA, notice to appear before an immigration judge. So the notice to report is a step in between before they go to an immigration judge. So if you can work with me on this time period, the top 10 backlog locations, New York, number one, mostly booked through March of 2033. They got about 32,000 plus there. San Antonio, I was surprised about San Antonio, but it's number two, booked up through March 2023. Miramar, Florida, Los Angeles, it goes on Jacksonville, Milwaukee, Chicago, Washington, Denver, and then Mount Laurel in New Jersey rounds up the top. So it goes from 2033 to March of 2027. So they go to ICE and report. Let's take New York. They'll report up to March of 2033. Then they get a notice to appear, an NTA, notice to appear, and then that's another 2-3 years before they can go up to a judge. So if we take 2033, add another 2-3 years, we're talking about 2035 or 2036. So keep in mind, the affordable housing units, I mean, they got to live somewhere. And I'm concerned about what's happening here. So my question is, what is ICE doing to expedite some of the work? Are we looking at detention, as the chairman mentioned? Are we looking at more additional removal flights for the ones that should be removed? What are we looking at? Do you have enough resources to fund, to execute these strategies? Because again, it's a little concerning that some of them have to wait to 2033 just to appear before you, and then they have to get another 2-3 years before they even go to an immigration judge to get either a stay to, either they stay or they get a final deportation orders. And I think we have over 1 million final deportation orders are still pending on that. So start off with, my concern is for the folks that live here in the U.S., there's not enough housing, but then we're adding all this extra folks coming in.
No, good question. I think there's a number of efforts that are underway that's going to help us issue NTAs in places like New York much sooner. There are some technology solutions that are in the works that is going to allow us to issue NTAs virtually. There is a request to the Hill to give us the authority that we could actually serve it virtually and have people agree to accept their documents electronically. So that is certainly something that we'll continue to work with the Congress to sort of get the authority for. But we are working on the technological piece of it so that we can do these telephonic interviews or virtual interviews and have individuals not have to wait 10 years to have their charging documents issued. There's also the online change of address form or technology solution that we're working on, which will allow individuals to opt in to receiving mail-out NTAs. And we think that too will certainly help eliminate the backlog. CBP is also, given the large number of individuals that we've released, they're also beefing up their staff to help ICE tackle this backlog. So with them joining the fight and, if we get the additional resources in FY24 that we're slated for, like 145 ERAs, additional 45 ICE officers that are going to be assigned to the non-detained docket, we believe this additional staffing will go a long way and help more quickly eliminating the NTA backlog.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for being here today to answer some of these difficult questions about how we're dealing with these populations. When I look at the non-detained docket and I see the 22 annual report said there was a 29% increase. That number has now grown from 3 million to 5.3 million that we're holding on that program now. And what really confuses me is we've got 1.2 million that Mr. Cuellar just referred to. They've had their adjudication, but they're still here. We're not deporting these folks in the numbers that we should be. In fact, in 2019, Arrow was moving out 247,000. Last year, we did 67,000. I don't quite understand how these numbers can work. And then when I look at my Jacksonville area, several ICE check-in offices have significant backlogs. For instance, Jacksonville is booked through 2020, and this goes to the point that Mr. Cuellar was making. Jacksonville is booked through 2028, and that's just for them to get into the court. And from there, it could be several more years before their case is decided. And I think this is just a symptom of just how broken this system is, and yet we don't seem to be responding to it. We're cutting resources. We're not utilizing beds. We're just letting people come across the border. So can you, because Mr. Cuellar brought up the same issue, I want to ask, do you have an average number of times? I know what it is in Jacksonville. It's 5 years just to get seen. What's the average around the country? Because, as he mentioned, these folks have got to have somewhere to stay, and technology is not going to put them in a bed. What's the average number?
The average varies pretty widely by location. If I had to sort of guess, I would say it's probably 2 years throughout the country.
That's the shortest?
That's probably the average, because most of the offices aren't nearly as inundated.
So Jacksonville is 2.5 times the average?
Florida, I mean, a lot of people are going to Florida. If you were looking at some of our smaller offices in Baltimore, for instance, or St. Paul, Minnesota, the wait time is significantly less. So it's the major metropolitan areas that are going to have the longest wait times. And we think with the additional staffing, CBP actually joining the game and helping process some of these folks that we released on the southern border, and obviously the technological solutions.
Okay, so let me stop you and ask this question, because Secretary Mayorkas was here and told this committee that ICE was removing a higher percentage of criminal aliens in '21 than in the previous years, and got into statistical numbers and that sort of thing. Now, you ran ERO. You know what those numbers used to be. Can you, as an assistant acting director right now, can you tell me how are those numbers down so significantly?
I think
I
it's
mean, from 247,000
I think it's a number.
to 67,000? How can that be?
Well, I think we do have to factor in the expulsions, because a lot of ICE's and ERO's resources that would typically be used for Title VIII removals are now being diverted to the southwest border to expel individuals. They're using our planes, our seats on the plane, so you do have to factor in the 70, 80,000
Let me
ICE
stop you, though.
removals.
Those expulsions were going on before, too. That the secretary, when he was here, answered Mr. Klein's question, I think it was, about deportations. And he tried to merge together the expulsions, too, because that's a big number. It was like 1.2 million, I think. But it's all expulsions. It's not deportations. Why are the deportation numbers down so low?
And again, the expulsions only started when the CDC emergency declaration order kicked in. There were always quick removals, voluntary returns, and the like at the border, but not using ICE airframes. I would submit that when you look at the number of folks that we've expelled on ICE air, combined with our Title VIII removals, you will see that those two numbers combined sort of get really close to what our removal numbers were in FY19. I also think that there was fewer people that were being introduced in the criminal justice system over during the pandemic, particularly the beginning of the pandemic, and that too resulted in far fewer referrals to ERO than.
All right, I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Recognize Ms. Sundberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, thanks for being with us today. In recent months, the heartbreaking stories of migrant children illegally working long hours and dangerous jobs has captured the attention of Congress and the public. These children are some of the most vulnerable among us, and this situation is unacceptable. We need an all-of-government approach to protect these children, stop and prevent their exploitation, and hold bad actors accountable. And Homeland Security Investigations has an important role to play through its duty to conduct criminal investigations into forced child labor. Can you describe how HSI is working in coordination with other agencies, including the Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, to combat illegal child labor?
Very, very good question, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to hear stories where kids are being exploited. HSI, just because of their international and domestic footprint, are strategically situated to lead the effort on child exploitation, and they've done a good job, but there's tons of work to do. It starts with investigating these crimes, bringing the perpetrators to justice, and rescuing the victims, and that is a priority for HSI. A lot of it is getting out to the communities and educating folks on some of the signs to look for and how to sort of convey that information back to HSI through our tip line if they believe that there are individuals that are being subject to sort of labor exploitation. We have been working really closely with the Department of Labor over the last year and a half to make sure that we're getting information from them, as well as working closely with HHS, who are typically responsible for releasing these kids to sponsors to let ICE know and work with our special agents if they have any reason to believe that kids are being sent to individuals that are making them work in these labor camps.
More organized criminal operations may be seeing opportunities here to exploit children as well, something that HSI also investigates. For example, NBC News reported earlier this year that DHS is investigating the potential trafficking of children for work cleaning slaughterhouses. And ICE's reports have indicated an increase in forced child labor investigations and enforcement in recent years. Obviously, understanding you can't comment on open forced child labor investigations, what are the trends that you're seeing here more broadly?
So in FY '22, ICE rescued 1,900 victims from child exploitation. This is, in '22, this is the first time that ICE has actually captured that data, so we don't have the ability to compare it to prior years. But it is a priority for us, and it's the reason why we started tracking it this year, and we'll continue to do so in the future.
Excuse me, Mr. Johnson, has that data been publicly released?
I am not sure if it's been released. I think we have a congressional requirement to report it, but I will have to circle back and let you know whether it's been released.
Well, given the attention that this issue's been in the news and obviously how it's so contrary to our American values, I think that level of transparency would be warranted. And certainly, we would look forward to receiving that information and any details that you would be free to share with this committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I want to turn now to ICE's reputational challenges, which you and I discussed during your testimony before the subcommittee last year. These challenges are so severe that at the end of 2021, the Washington Post reported that HSI agents proposed separating from ICE because of the degree which ICE's negative reputation impedes their ability to conduct investigations. I asked then how you were working to address the behaviors and actions that led to those reputational challenges at ICE. It's been a year since we last discussed this. Since then, can you share what you've done to improve ICE's relationship with local communities? And what specific changes is ICE making to increase accountability and build trust?
Very, very good question. And like I mentioned last year, this has been an issue that we've been grappling within ICE for many, many years. One of the things we did this year was to give HSI the flexibility to use whatever branding they felt was necessary to increase cooperation in the communities. So in other words, if removing the ICE moniker completely and just using the HSI brand was going to result in greater cooperation, they had the flexibility to do so. We've also removed or gave them the option of removing the ICE part of their email exchange address so that it's just hsi.dhs.gov instead of the ICE piece of that. That too has been extremely helpful in certain areas of the country. So while I am not a supporter of sort of splitting the agency into two, I am a huge supporter of providing all the flexibilities I can to HSI so that they may successfully complete their mission.
Well, ICE has a responsibility to proactively and intentionally build trust in the communities that you serve. And so I think that this is an area where the agency definitely needs to do more. And I would encourage you to continue to focus on this in 2023. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Underwood. We'll now recognize Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Acting Director Johnson, for coming before our committee again. It's great to see you, and thank you to the men and women who serve in your agency. I know it's not easy work, and I appreciate your service and theirs. One of my top concerns with the crisis we're seeing at our southern border is that we know that individuals on the terror watch list, sex offenders, some of these transnational gang members, drug traffickers, human traffickers, the list goes on of the bad people with violent criminal histories that we are seeing come into our country. They've exploited that weakness at our southern border, and even the Chinese Communist Party is taking advantage of it too. So my question to you is, are there times of year when ICE experiences increases in the number of investigations or removals of these types of criminals specifically, or surges, or times where you see more criminals that then you are having to deploy agents into the Homeland to focus on those removals?
So at least from an HSI perspective, it's always critically important that they focus on these individuals that pose a national security threat. So we have a cadre of seasoned agents who do nothing but work those types of cases. You know, oftentimes their focus is on the criminal aspect of it. You know, the removal and sort of administrative piece is sort of secondary. And, you know, once these individuals are finished their sentences, they would be referred to ERO or put in removal proceedings for removal. With the flow along the southwest border, we have been focusing on, you know, some of the unusual populations, folks that typically, we don't typically see coming across, and just making sure that we have a good response to them and designating some number of detention beds for those individuals as well.
Right, and obviously, we've seen that number significantly increase. How are you communicating with our state and local tribal territorial law enforcement on these issues, especially in maybe rural communities like mine? Because obviously, you know, you talked a lot about the flows into some of the more populated areas, but it is an impact in states like mine as well. And the last thing we want is to see criminals, you know, come into places like this because maybe they're thinking it'll be less enforced. So what are you doing to communicate with those levels of law enforcement?
So in areas where we have great cooperation, I mean, obviously Iowa is one of them. We have really, really great relationships with our state and local partners. We do have challenges in other areas where folks aren't as cooperative, and we'll just have to continue to work with them to find some middle ground. But our relationships with our state and local partners are the bread and butter of our success. And, you know, whether they're participating in some of our task forces or on our best teams, you know, those relationships are critical, especially in smaller areas where it's just a small law enforcement community. Generally, everybody needs to just band together. So it's certainly important. We're always out sort of working with our state and locals and trying to make sure we have each other's back.
Yeah. Well, if there are jurisdictions that are creating challenges for you in executing your mission, please let me know. I'd love to work with you on making sure that they are following through, because ultimately this is a safety and security issue, not only for Iowans, but for all Americans. So I want to make sure that you have the cooperation necessary to do your job. I want to move quickly to the contingency fund conversation. You got assurances, obviously, that even with the reduction of $560 million to your budget, that those detention beds would be available from the contingency fund if you're at certain levels. What levels were those exactly?
I can't remember the thresholds. I just know that they were really, really low, and that we have been at that threshold for the better part of, you know, the last 5
So you would meet
years.
those levels for sure?
So, I mean, I made, my biggest concern is on October 1, I was going to need those funds.
Right.
And when we looked at the thresholds, we weren't going to have to wait 90 days. The funds would be available. So I am confident that we would not be required to take beds offline before we brought them back on.
So let me pose this question to you. What happens, though, if that fund has been depleted? Does that mean that you would not have the necessary resources to expand the beds you need?
It would be hard to deplete the funds, you know, 2 weeks into the new fiscal year, as I understand it. I mean, look, there's a lot of details that have to be worked out with this contingency fund. It's the first time we've ever done anything like this. I think it's a good concept, because we do need a way to, you know, get access to additional money when the border is you know, seeing unusually high levels. In my personal view, I wish the 34,000 beds would have been in my base, and then I would have been able to gain access to, you know, 5,000 or 10,000 beds as part of the contingency fund, but it didn't shake out that way.
Well, I think that taking funding away from your baseline budget and putting it in a contingency slush fund that could be used for other services is reckless when you need those funds to actually execute on your mission. So I see this as a budget gimmick, and I think that we should be prioritizing getting you those funds directly. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now, the chair will now recognize Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Chairman Joyce, Director Johnson. Thank you for being with us. And I too want to thank you and the men and women that are under you for the hard work that you do. So I'm going to return to one of the subjects that was already brought up. As you reported last year, this administration removed 72,000 and some immigrants. I've gotten some feedback here for some reason. I think you can still hear me. Then that does not include Title 42 removals. This past December, 250,000 plus people were encountered by the Border Patrol. So removing less than a third of the number of encounters in a single month took an entire year. And that's on top of a record-breaking year of 2.76 million encounters. So being in charge of removal orders and removing immigrants, a couple questions. How would you justify that this posture benefits border and national security? And is this a sustainable posture? The administration repeatedly has said that those without lawful asylum claims will be swiftly removed. So can you tell me today that swift removals are happening? And also, why aren't we doing more to at least remove the known criminals and the repeat offenders?
Good question. In terms of swift removals, I would argue that we are doing it for those that are detained in ICE custody. Folks that have been following this work for a long time, it's that's typically where the bulk of our removal orders come from, and it is extremely difficult to remove individuals from the non-detained docket. I do not think it's sustainable. But I also do not think that there's enough detention capacity in the private sector or that exists for us to detain our way out of this. I think that there are a number of efforts that are underway. The discussions with the Colombians and the Panamanians should go a long way. We're certainly asking for additional planes and resources so that we can fly more removal flights more quickly. More often to some of the countries that we're getting hammered the most on. So we think that too will certainly help us, get some of these folks back to their home countries quickly. And in addition to Border Patrol creating some efficiencies and doing some of the credible fear screenings in their custody, ICE has also identified 9 facilities where we're going to try to get people through the credible fear process much quicker than it's typically done in prior years. And hopefully that'll just help us be able to sort of cycle through those beds much quicker at those 9 facilities and result in more removals.
I appreciate those suggestions. The other thing I want to ask you about is fentanyl. My understanding is that a small number of vehicles, cars, trucks are inspected, but we're confiscating a huge amount of fentanyl. And due to the severe damage we're seeing in our country, I'd like to know, realizing that CBP is primarily responsible for those inspections and that you're called in, I guess, after the fact, the question remains, how are we as a country going to get a handle on this? Essentially, who's going to take ownership of this problem? I think the American people want to know what's it going to take. So I'm pleading with you. Tell me what we can do to stop this scourge of drugs coming in the southern border.
So as you mentioned, CBP is at the ports of entry. They're conducting the inspections. We have deployed a significant number of HSI agents to the border to assist. You may be familiar with Operation Blue Lotus, where we've sent a number of folks to 2 ports of entry there, where in just over 30 days, we've seized 8,000 pounds
Some success there, yeah.
of narcotics, 4,000 pounds of which was fentanyl, which just goes to show you, if you throw more resources at this problem, you'll get some big wins. I think HSI is probably best situated to sort of, tackle, to combat and dismantle the TCOs that are responsible for fentanyl, particularly our relationships and our vetting units and TCIUs in Mexico, which is, that's ground zero from where China is sending the precursor chemicals. In FY22, HSI, in close coordination with our Mexican partners, seized 3.3 million pounds of precursor chemicals. We know those were all sort of headed to the U.S. We seized 22,000 or 21,000 pounds of fentanyl in FY22, and this year in FY23 through February, we've already seized 27,000 pounds of fentanyl. So, there's a lot of work to be done. HSI is I mean, it's a high priority for them, and we'll continue to work with our foreign partners to sort of increase our apprehensions.
I know we're out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to say that I believe that all those big numbers, and that's great that we're confiscating that much. My feeling is that that's probably the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more that we've got to do. So I look forward to working with you on this and getting a handle on this huge, huge issue. Thank you. Thank you.
Recognize Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Acting Director. And yes, to echo the thoughts of everyone on this committee, we certainly appreciate the work of your agency and the boots on the ground who are doing the hard work. I'm from South Texas, so we know this all too well about what's going on in regards to the need to secure our border. I wanted to ask you about a couple numbers. I was looking at the numbers of you returning people to their home country after they've entered illegally. In fiscal year 2022, it was 67,055. Comparing that to 2019 pre-COVID, it was 247,835. Even during 2020, during COVID, when we had a dip of we were able to return 173,849. And so all that to say, we have a substantial decrease in what your agency is doing at a time we're having a tremendous surge of illegal crossings at our border. I'm curious to have your thoughts on how and why that is happening.
So, again, as I mentioned, I think when you're looking at our removal numbers, you also have to look at the T-42 expulsions. The 185,000 figure that you, or 179,000 figure that you provided in FY20, that was, largely COVID-free for the first 9 months, and maybe the last 3 months of 20, there was some COVID removal impacts. But if you look at what we did in FY20 and you compare it to what our removals were in FY22, including the COVID, the Title 42 expulsions of 117,000, those FY22 numbers are pretty closely aligned with the FY20 total removals of 179 or 180,000 that you reference. I also think, as I mentioned, that a good number of our removal cases, at least in the interior, are from referrals from state and locals after they make arrests and charge people and they go through the
I understand
legal
that,
process.
but that part is not new. That wouldn't be part of the change. That's a constant in this. And so, what we're seeing is that at an administration shift, we had 70% drop roughly, with no change roughly in funding, and actually a slight bump up in manpower. We are the Appropriations Committees. We're supposed to be making sure resources are used properly. And so I'm trying to wonder, dollar per activity here doesn't really seem to match up as to what we would expect to see to be the effectiveness of
I
the
think
resources
once
we're sending your way.
Title 42 is lifted and we're no longer doing these 242 expulsions and we just go back to our Title 8 removals, which is what ICE and ERO has done for 30 years, I think you'll see the removal numbers start to go up to where they have been historically. Just transitioning from Title 8 to Title 42 is something that was new to the agency, and I'm sure there was some lost efficiency.
All this,
as part
of course, in the proper context, if there's a right way to come to our country in an illegal way, and every illegal entry is dollars to a cartel, you know, that's also funneling drugs and destabilizing other countries. I'm out of time. I had another line of questioning, but, well, okay, I have a little time. Do you know, have you heard of ICE Council?
ICE Council,
Yes. Are you familiar with the ICE Council?
the union?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Recently, they had essentially filed a whistleblower grievance with the DOJ, alleging that AFGE had, and I mean, there's a number of news articles I could print out, just some of the nefarious actions that had happened there, misusing funds that the union had used literally to go to strip clubs and those kind of things. And so shortly after that, the AFGE filed a separation of interest, basically to remove the ICE Council from the parent organization, which also, because of some arcane rules in the union, basically, they were able to seize $5 million of assets from ICE Council. Are you concerned at all about this? Did you ever reach out to ICE Council why this was happening last year?
I was not aware of the sort of the background that you just provided. I was only aware that the AFG had requested that the Council 118 no longer be a part of AFG, but wasn't tracking what led up to it. So
You
no.
think it'd be important to find out why? I mean, they were being kicked out of the union, basically?
Given what you've said, I will certainly look into it.
Yeah, I
whether
mean,
this was
just
the
from the
case.
sniff test, it sure seems like a union, you know, after somebody files a grievance against them with the DOJ is suddenly kicked out and millions of dollars of assets. So I'd certainly appreciate if you could look into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. The chair now recognizes Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Johnson, thank you for being here today. Does what occurs on the southwest border, does that impact your agency?
Yes, it does.
And recently, the Chief of Border Patrol testified before Congress that 5 of the 9 sectors along the southwest border are not secure. Would you agree with his assessment?
I would defer to the Border Patrol.
So if the Chief of the Border Patrol said that, then you would defer to him versus Secretary Mayorkas, who continues to maintain that the border is secure from sea to shining seas. Is that correct?
I would defer to them over me making any sort of an assessment as to whether the border is secure or not.
And in your budget, there is a budget decrease for detention beds. Last year, on average, according to your report from December 30, 2022, in the ICE annual report, you stated that the average, or the report, and I'm not citing you, I'm assuming your agency stated that on average, there were 22,630 individuals in detention. Does that number sound correct?
Sounds about right.
And we know that looking at the report as far as the docket that your agency maintains, that there are over 4.7 million individuals, non-citizens, that are in the United States in some shape, form, or fashion, roughly 1.2 million where there are final orders of removal, and then 3.5 million, according to this, where there have been no final orders of removal. Does that 4,750,000 figure, does that sound accurate?
It does.
And we know last year, your agency removed roughly 72,000 individuals from the country, correct?
That's correct.
And of those individuals that were removed, we know that some of those individuals were individuals who had criminal histories.
That is also correct.
Your report says that of the 72,000, that 44,096 of those individuals had criminal histories. that of those 44,000 people, there were 183,251 charges associated with them for an average of 4.2 charges and convictions per person, that there were 17,336 who were charged with assault, 7,370 charged with sex offenses or sexual assault, 4,711 individuals charged with weapon offenses, 1,315 charged with homicide-related offenses, 953 were charged or convicted of kidnapping, that your agency removed 2,667 known or suspected gang members, and to me, the most troubling of all is 56 known or suspected terrorists were removed from the country last year. And so my question is, we've got this huge number, this huge population where your agency is responsible for trying, and I know that you don't have the manpower, and I'm not blaming you personally, I'm blaming the system. But we have a system in where we have 4.7 million people who are loose in the country that we, in many cases, don't know where those people are. We only have bed space to detain 25,000. We're not using all that bed space. We have what we know to be some of those individuals are violent criminals because we deported them last year, including known or suspected terrorists, but we're asking for a decrease in the detention beds. And to me, that is the worst thing we should do. Clearly, we need detention beds because some of the people we're allowing to come into the country, your report here, your annual report talks about how bad these individuals are, that they've killed people, they've assaulted people sexually, that they're known or terrorists, known or suspected terrorists, and yet you're coming in and you're asking, your agency is, and I'm assuming that you approved the budget, you're asking for a decrease in detention beds. So I'm asking you to please justify to me why we need to be spending less money on detention beds when we're seeing a huge rise in immigrant population, when we know that some of that population are committing violent offenses because you documented in your report. And so please, in the last 20 seconds that I have remaining of my time, please justify to me why we should be reducing detention beds and not adding detention beds.
So, very good question. I would say that we are not reducing our detention beds, that 25,000 of the beds are in our base budget, and the remaining 9,000 beds are in the contingency fund that, as I've already explained, I believe I will have access to.
Why are they not in the primary budget? Why are they in the contingency budget? If detention beds are important, which I believe that they are, and I believe many people on this committee, Republicans and Democrats, would believe that detention beds are important, for them not to be in the primary, to me, is a colossal failure. No. And so if you could explain why they're in the contingency versus the primary, I would love to hear that. If you can't explain that, then I understand, and I'll move on because I know my time has expired.
I cannot explain exactly why it was structured that way. But, you know, what was most important for me as an operator was that I was going to have access to those 9,000 beds the first day of the fiscal year, and that's what I was assured of.
Are 34,000 beds enough?
Enough for what? I guess
Enough
would be
to
the
perform
question.
the mission that you're tasked to do.
I mean,
when we have 4.7 million people that are in the country and we're only detaining somewhere between 25,000 and 34,000, I mean, that's what, less than 0.5%?
I mean, you have to draw the line somewhere. I mean, 70,000, in my view, 70,000 beds wouldn't put much more of a dent in this problem than 35,000.
What should the number be? As the director of this agency, what is the proper number of detention beds?
It would depend on what you and what folks actually thought was an acceptable number of.
Well, I'm asking you what your opinion, because I mean you clearly have been involved with this agency. You know, on one hand, we're saying that we last year utilized 22, we're budgeting 25. We think we might be up to 34.
We have historically made do with 34.
But we've
in
not seen the immigrant
2019.
surge that we've seen the last 2 years. I mean, we've had record immigrant surge the last 2 years and on pace to break that record again. We've got 4.7 million in the country, 1.2 million, which should be removed because there are removal orders that we're not removing from the country. And we know that there are some of those people who are released into the interior are violent individuals, or at least commit violent crimes once they're released into the interior, because that's documented in your report.
No, I certainly agree that the folks who commit violent crimes have to be a priority for detention beds. In 2019, there was a similar surge, probably not nearly as much, but still fairly significant, and we brought on 20,000 additional beds, and we filled those beds up in no time as well. So I personally don't think there's a number of beds that you could actually buy that's going to solve the problems that this problem that we're seeing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm over time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. We'll now recognize Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I see by your biography, began your federal career in the 1st Congressional District of Maryland in Salisbury. Let me follow up a little bit, because we're throwing number 4.7 million out, but that's end of FY22, which was 6 months ago. What's the latest figure?
About just under 5.3 million.
Ooh, okay, so we're now near 5.3 million. So we're, and I assume our removals have stayed roughly in the ballpark of 70,000 per year? I mean, at roughly that ballpark?
No, I actually think removals are up a little bit, but I don't have the number
Yeah,
right.
not by 600,000 though, right?
sure.
Yeah, right. So we're kind of in a situation where we have an accelerating number, and I can see why you'd want, the alternative to detention program. But let me ask you, what percent of those people now in ATD have the technology of an ankle bracelet, a wrist bracelet, whatever? Is that what we're doing for most people now?
It's a combination of ankle monitors, smartphones. I would say that at least 50% are on some kind of technology, and that could be an ankle monitor, it could be a smartphone, or it could be a watch.
So 50% don't have that. They're just released into the interior.
No, 50% are on some other lower form of.
Oh, a lower form,
yeah,
okay.
Telephonic reporting or something along those lines.
And of those, of that non-detained docket of now 5.3 million, what percent don't check in or have cut off the ankle bracelet or whatever? They're just not complying.
So let me clarify. The 4.7 million or 5.2 million or 3 million, only about 200,000 of those, and I think that number, it's around 200,000 are actually on ATD. So of the, so just a very small subset of the total number of people on the non-detained docket are receiving enhanced monitoring that's allowed on the ATD program.
So I guess I don't understand. If we have 600,000 more people on the docket in the last 6 months, but only 200,000 total have this, who doesn't get it? I mean, a large percent of people don't get it, right? So they're just released into the interior, promise to come back.
Or they start off with it, they have ATD, and they are enrolled in ATD for some period of time, and then they're taken off to make room for some of the new folks that are coming across the southwest border. But there is a good number of folks that do not get put on ATD. Obviously, the kids that are part of family units wouldn't get on ATD as well, and a good chunk of the 4.2 million are representative of families.
That makes sense. So, there's some people who say, if you cross the border illegally, it's kind of a civil offense, not criminal offense. But if you have a final order of removal, the 1.2 million final orders, does that become a criminal offense, not complying with that final order?
It's not a criminal offense today.
So it's also it's only a civil offense, non-compliance. And the punishment being negligible, I guess, because there are 1.2 million people doing it.
Or removal. I mean, that's part of the issue is just you have to figure out a way to incentivize people to comply with their removal order, and until something like that's done. Now, look, we get a good number of people, albeit small, that do comply with their removal order on a non-detained docket, but it is extremely staff intensive, takes a lot of hand-holding, but we 30, 40 a month, which is certainly not as high as many would like, but it's better than zero.
Sure. And, you've got to be frustrated because, the title of your agency has the word enforcement in it, but you really don't have the resources to enforce the law, do you? With regards to removals? You clearly don't have the resources.
We certainly are under-resourced.
With that. Just a ballpark. If you said, and I was going to ask you, what's the average cost of a removal? I don't know if you know the figure. What does it cost your agency on average to remove someone? Because I can do the math multiplied by 1.2 million to know what your budget would have to be, but what's the average cost, do you think?
From memory, it's, and again, since we do the bulk of our removals via charter airlines or ICE Air, which is our, flying people, 135 folks at a time. If I remember correctly, that's $17,000 per hour. Each flight on average is probably 5 hours, so I don't know.
But you have to find them also. I mean, part of removal is you have to find them and remove them, so that's labor intensive.
Most of the removals are, most of the Title VIII removals historically have come from our detained environment.
Okay, I understand. Well, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. We recognize Mr. Trone for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we were late. We have too many overlapping hearings. Thank you, Director Johnson, for joining us, Chairman Joyce, Ranking Member Cuellar. ICE has worked through Homeland Security investigations on the front line of the TCOs and the cartels. You're right there in the front line. Your budget request in 24 has asked for an increase in the tools to assist in stopping these networks and human smuggling, fentanyl, killing 100,000 Americans every year. These budget cuts that have been proposed to go back to FY '22, how's that going to affect your ability to stop the fentanyl from these cartels that's come into the U.S. through legal ports of entry?
So I'm not tracking what cuts you're referring to. I know we certainly received some additional funding in FY '24. We're asking for funding to increase.
The cut will be to go back to the '22 budget, which has been proposed. So you went up in '23, you've asked for more in '24, which is, sounds like it's needed. But going back to '22, what's that going to do to you?
Well, it certainly, I thought the cuts had to do with the number of individuals that we just weren't able to get through the hiring process in any given fiscal year. And that's the cut that was provided. So if it's something different than
Not
that,
having
then I
enough
might not-
employees will be a cut.
Well, right, but I certainly agree. But at least in terms of the fentanyl context, we were given 40 million, if my memory serves, to sort of increase sort of our fight against the fentanyl crisis. There was also funding to allow our Mexican vetted units, our TCIUs, to have access to Raven, which we think is going to go a long way at not only dealing with this fentanyl crisis, but also child sexual exploitation and some of the other heinous crimes.
Okay, well, we certainly need to protect the budget where it deals with fentanyl. We can't let it continue to come. How about I've heard about the administration's considering restarting the detention of families. While some that pose a public safety risk, I get it, but certainly a family can navigate their immigration case best from their home, not behind bars or in detention. So FEMA and ICE community-based alternatives to detention policies, particularly those that utilize case management and service by qualified nonprofits, have shown to be cost-effective and have a high compliance rate with immigration obligations. Can you talk about how the '24 budget will expand these community-based alternatives and the noise that we're hearing about restarting family detention? Is that true or not?
So there's certainly been some discussions about just like options for dealing with the families coming across the border. Family detention is something that we've done historically. It was raised as a potential option, and it was something that at least was not met with great, exception amongst the leaders. So at this time, there's certainly no plan to restart family detention in any way, shape, or form. The current plan is to continue to use our alternatives to detention, where we would put the parents or the adults, the heads of household, on some sort of form of ATD. And we're also looking at potentially developing a home curfew program, which would be similar to like house arrest, and piloting something like that. So that's also on the horizon, but there's been no decision to restart family detention.
Great. Talk a minute about the '24 budget. How's that going to expand community-based alternatives?
So the '24 budget, the '23 budget actually reduced our ATD program. I think our '24 budget may keep it steady at 170, if my memory serves. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of funding to significantly increase our ATD, but I think some of what you're describing is the FEMA-based grants, which I believe is funding that FEMA gets, not necessarily ICE funding.
Okay, great. And secondly, according to U.S.-Mexico joint statement, April 13th, DHS committed expanding its efforts to disrupt gun smuggling to Mexico through ICE's Operation Without a Trace, Desert Lightning. However, there's a GAO recommendation for ICE to identify performance measures for these. How do we plan to measure these efforts of preventing firearms? That's what we'd like to see, is some data and some measurements on how we stop getting these firearms to cartels with these new efforts.
No, very good question and good point. I mean, that has definitely been a priority over the last year, more outbound inspections. It's certainly something that the Mexican government has been pushing us to do more of, and we have certainly committed to do the same. So I think, over the last month and the upcoming months, you'll start to see more outbound inspections that include both ICE and CBP.
Certainly, we've asked the Mexican government to help us on fentanyl. They've not been helpful. They've asked us to help on the guns. So someone needs to take the first step. So thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Recognize myself for a second round of questionings. Mr. Johnson, it's no secret at the end of Title 42 will have a significant impact on our immigration system. ICE previously released tens of thousands of non-citizens into the interior to ensure detention capacity for the projected surge following the end of Title 42. Is ICE planning to release detainees into the interior in order to make room for the record-high border crossing projections ahead of May 11th, like you did previously? And if so, how many, and what are the metrics that you're basing that decision on?
Very good question, sir. We're sitting at around 26,000 individuals in custody today. We're certainly going to try to get that number down to close to 22,000 or 21,000 leading into May 11. We hope to do that primarily through increased removals, but it may, if we'll continue to look at our detained docket, and if there are individuals that are sitting in custody and where removal is not likely foreseeable in a reasonable future, then we would probably look to release some individuals just to free some space. So there will be some combination of releases, but mostly removals to get our population down.
Do you anticipate needing additional supplemental resources to address the coming surge after the end of Title 42?
I do anticipate the need for additional resources. As someone pointed out early on, we were already looking at a $485 million shortfall. We've asked for funding to cure that hole, and we certainly anticipating some additional transportation and airframe requirements as a result of the end of Title 42.
When you make this decision to release people to the interior, what is the vetting process that you're putting these individuals through before you let them run amok in our country?
Well, obviously, we're focusing on those that are either non-crims or, very low-level criminals. I mean, I don't know that we've gotten to the point where we've even had to consider releasing any low-level criminals. But if there are certain border cases, we'll run them through our regular checks, which includes criminal history. But most of the folks that we're releasing from custody would not have a criminal history.
Well, they may in the country of origin, but you don't bother to look at those, correct?
We don't have access to those, we don't have access to many of those countries' records.
Thank you. I'll yield to my distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cuellar, if he has any second-round questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things, just follow up from some of the info that y'all provided. You all have here that as of 4/16 of 2023, the total CBP prosecutorial discretion releases add up to 802,000 people. As you know, by that is when they're overwhelmed, Border Patrol will put them on the notice to report with y'all and not the notice to appear before an immigration judge. This 802,000 plus, is this fiscal year? Or is it
This is-
since when?
This is since March 21, 2021. So
Okay.
since they actually started using the parole ATD or notice to report. So basically, 25-month period?
Okay, all right. The other thing, on the top 10, parole, and you mentioned that some other ICE offices don't have that type of workload. Have you, besides asking for more resources and technology and electronic signatures, have y'all moved around some of your staff or to try to, I mean, if somebody's handling a lot less than, let's say, New York City, can you move people around? Because I know we did that in some other areas. Can you look at that possibility? I mean, if you got 10 people working here, they're only handling 10 cases. You got 10 people working here, but they're handling 50 cases, as an example, then, whatever you can do to move that around, that would be good.
It's typically, the limiting factor is just the infrastructure. I mean, it's still the individual, even if we have somebody in Iowa, for instance, processing somebody in New York, they actually have to come and sit in the office so that we can actually talk to them and take their fingerprints and the like. So, I mean, we're like I said, we're working on a technological solution to help with this, but it's just not a matter of processing them virtually because they still need to come to an ICE office to be fingerprinted.
Yeah. Well, let's try to think outside the box as much as possible. Finally, my last question has to do with the coordination that you have with the Executive Office of Immigration Review, that is the new judges. We've been adding judges for many years. I think we started the push 2014, I believe. And right now, as you know, if you look at the current immigration judges, they're authorized at 734, but onboarded only 634. So there's still 76 currencies. They take a long time to hire judges. Same thing with almost any federal agency, the streamlining process. But the department's asking for 150 new immigration judge teams in its budget. But I noticed that your Office of Principal Legal Advisor has requested no new judges. Shouldn't we be working the same with the immigration judges so we can have a backlog? Can you tell me what efforts y'all are, why not ask for any monies to add new attorneys?
So over the last 2 fiscal years, in 23 and in 22, we have been fortunate enough to get additional funding to increase our OPLA attorneys. We currently have 341 enhancement positions on the books, and we've only hired about 144. The thought is that it was probably going to take us the rest of this fiscal year to just get through, and maybe some of next, to hire the balance of the 341 enhancement positions that we've gotten over the last 2 years. And the focus in FY '24 was going to be on just the facilities piece, making sure the OPLA attorneys that we actually have hired over the last 2 years actually have adequate office space in close proximity to the judges that they're going to be working, pretty close with. So that's the focus, at least in '24, is the facilities piece and the like. And I'm sure in '25, we'll probably continue our request to beef up our staff.
And finally, the work on fentanyl with Mexico, as you know, DEA is not in the best of standing with Mexico, and they emphasized that when we were there just a few weeks ago. So that means as they get the trust back in Mexico, your department has to play a big role in making sure that whether it's air cargoes or containers coming into Mexico, that we intercept that so we can stop the fentanyl from coming into the United States and mainly through ports of entry. So appreciate your help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cuellar. Recognize Mrs. Hinson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to follow up on something that we've already had quite a bit of discussion about, and that is fentanyl. As a mom to 2 school-age boys, I'm particularly concerned about what the cartels are doing to continue to market and employ new tactics to reach children in this fight. And obviously, we've talked about Blue Lotus, and we are closely following the effectiveness of those operations. But my questions are really about the cross-agency communication and making sure that that is still robust. It's essential for countering cartels, but I'm just curious, are there areas where you believe that communication could be strengthened between ICE and other DHS agencies to make sure that we're really exercising that cross-agency cooperation to our best ability?
I mean, I think we've done a really good job, particularly working with our partners at CBP. Certainly the DHS components, I think we're lockstep with and sort of fighting this particular issue. Obviously, with some of our DOJ partners, we could probably improve some of the cooperation and the like, but, there's a lot of territorial stuff going on, and, we'll work through it and continue to work with our federal partners. But I do think that, CBP, as long as we're both resourced appropriately, and Blue Lotus is a great example, of us just having the ability to focus and send more agents down to just help with this problem, we'll get the results. So, we're going to continue to ask for additional funding to deploy to the border, to the southwest border, to our best teams that are heavily focused on this fentanyl crisis.
Well, and I think everybody understands, and we've seen plenty of turf battles in the work that we do here, but we want to make sure that we're fulfilling that mission of being able to stop this fentanyl coming into the hands of our children. Let's talk a little bit about the Monroe Project specifically, since that is in the request. It's been successful in targeting cartels and connecting traffickers back to cartels. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work in that space? Because obviously with a $40 million budget request, I want to make sure that this tool is funded to the level needed for counter-trafficking from a comprehensive perspective. So if you can just elaborate a little bit on the successes that you've seen.
No, it's been extremely successful. It's focused right there on the southwest border. It's largely successful because of the relationships we have with our Mexican partners. We have a sort of TCIU. It's where Mexico is where we have our largest HSI footprint, which certainly results in some really good cases that are coming out of there. Again, the biggest thing that we've asked for in FY24 that's really going to help those investigations, and not just fentanyl, but human trafficking and drug smuggling writ large, is just giving those folks access to Raven. And just so that we can start dumping a lot of this big data and analyzing it and being able to identify additional TCOs and the like. So.
Yeah, well, and I guess my follow-up there would be, when you talk about access to all of that data, how are we really working to loop in local law enforcement? Because we want them to be able to see, obviously, if they've detained someone, we want to make sure that they have access to those HSI networks as well. What are you doing to make sure that that cooperation and that information is empowered to local law enforcement as well?
So there's about 4,000 state and local folks that are part of our task forces all throughout the country. And so we are pretty plugged in to the state and locals. I mean, HSI is I mean, there's a lot of folks that would prefer to work with HSI than some of the other federal partners. So that is, benefits us tremendously, and we'll continue to sort of reach out to our state and locals where those relationships don't exist to try to create those partnerships.
Absolutely. Well, I heard from a local sheriff recently who said, the cartels are so embedded even in a community in Iowa that it's like a hydra. You cut off one head and then two more pop up. And it's terrifying to think that that's happening right along Interstate 35 in my district. So real quick question. Obviously, you're talking about the need for additional full-time employees. My concerns are with morale within the agency because it is a very challenging space to work in. But are you concerned about being able to fulfill the hires to meet those needs?
I think we will have no issues filling the positions. We get a number of our folks, at least 30% last I checked, coming from CBP. The other 60% or so are from the outside. At least we have not seen a reduction in applicant interest in our positions when we especially HSI and ERO in particular. These you usually get hundreds of applicants for every one job. So despite the abolish ICE sort of rhetoric and some of the targeted accusations, we have still been fortunate enough to be able to keep a steady stream of applicants.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Simpson. Now we'll recognize Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Chairman Joyce, as always. I appreciate it. Just if you could follow up on the distinguished member from Iowa's questions on Blue Lotus. I mean, talk about its success a little bit, but then talk about what we need to make it more successful and get the top of the kingpins, which we never seem to quite get, or they operate with impunity in a Mexican jail that they control and run. And that's not really getting them. And then talk about why we couldn't have done this type of an operation a year ago.
So no, it's really about resources. And, there's a lot of priorities. We've been spending a lot of time and energy on human trafficking and human smuggling, trying to, figure out a way to disrupt the flows along the southwest border. So you have to just pick and choose where you want to divert the resources. So we certainly don't want to pull away from the good work that's being done on human trafficking and human smuggling. But you do have to find the resources to divert to fentanyl. And Operation Blue Lotus is just one example of everybody sort of putting their resources together to focus their law enforcement and investigative sort of focus at these two ports of entry that we actually believe are big, big part of how the fentanyl is coming into the country. So no, we're asking for additional funding in 24. We're going to continue to make it a priority. We're going to continue to try to bring on additional TCIUs and vetted units, get them the training here in the U.S., and increase our partnerships with countries, our foreign partners, so that we could continue our great work here. I think you were here when I mentioned the successes, the 36,700 criminal arrests that we made, the 27,000 pounds of fentanyl seizures, and then just you mentioned Blue Lotus, nearly 8,000 pounds of narcotics seized in just over 30 days, which is truly remarkable. So, we see firsthand that if we send the staff to the border to assist our CBP partners, there will be great results, and I think you're going to see more of that in the coming months.
And where are we in trying to attack the heads of the cartels, which, Obrador has been totally hands-off and just had a peace, a truce, to not have an open warfare?
Look, that's the goal of every HSI investigation, is to pull on every thread until you can get as high up in the organization as possible. It's not just as a result of our work in Mexico and our Mexican partners. But even when an individual overdoses here in the U.S. in our work with the state and locals, we're right there on the scene. We're looking at their phones, figuring out who they last made contact with, and following that all the way back as far as we can, as high up in the chain as we can, to target the head of the snake.
But at the head of the snake, I mean, we know who the head of those cartels are, Jalisco and the Sinaloa cartel. We know roughly where they are. And why are you unable to get the Mexican government to help us target them?
It's a delicate situation. I mean, it's some things the Mexican government is going to be willing to do, and some things they aren't so willing to do.
The government's willing to tolerate having the heads of the cartels run the cartels. We know where they are, we know who they are, and they're okay with that.
We work with our foreign partners as best we can, and for the things that they're willing to help us with, we accept it, and we do try to push them in certain areas where we can. But at the end of the day, we have very little legal authority in Mexico to do anything ourselves.
Well, we thank you for, working with them and doing that, but I don't call that partnership. That's a different word. It's hardly partners when they don't partner the whole way up to the top. And we just, indicted the head of the Mexican government's, all their efforts on drug trafficking for a decade. Their top guy, we just indicted him, and he's the one we shared all of our secrets with for over a decade, and we trusted implicitly. And of course, now we know he was on the cartel's payroll the entire time. So there hasn't been a partnership, so to speak. And I think a lot of Americans are fed up with it. We're fed up with 100,000 deaths. So I yield back.
I think you have unanimous agreement on that, Mr. Trone. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Guest, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the detention docket again. FY '21, roughly 3.7 million total on the detention docket. FY '22, it grew by 1 million to now roughly 4.7, slightly over 4.7. Based on what I've read and what I've heard, also it appears that for the first roughly half of FY '23, that has grown by another 600. And by the end of the year, assuming that things continue, the total number of individuals on the non-detention document will reach close to 6 million, which is a huge increase over the last 2 years. And so as we've seen a growing increase in the non-detention docket, of that, we know that 1.2 million on that detention docket, at least at the end of FY '22, had final orders of removal. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a final order of removal means that that case has been played out through the judicial system. An immigration judge has determined that that individual has no legal status to remain in the country, and that at that point, once that individual is encountered, that individual is to be removed from the country. So we know that at least of that, somewhere where we sit right now, 5.3 million, 1.2 million have already completed their legal proceedings. They have been ordered to be removed. And so as we see these numbers grow, whether it be on the non-detention docket, we've seen that the number of removals, particularly going back from 2019, has decreased dramatically. 2019 removals were roughly 247,000. We know that the last 2 years, that number has hovered. I think last year was an increase from the year before. The year before, I think, was roughly 60,000. Last year, roughly 72,000. And so my question is we seem to be doing a worse job of removing people from the country at a time in which we have an increase in cases, and I want to ask, is that because you don't have the resources? Is that the policies that have been placed down? You know, I've been told that there were policies placed by this administration that unless an individual had been convicted of a crime, that we weren't to actually go out and enforce orders of removal. And if we've been asked not to enforce orders of removal, which are orders by a judge to go do something, I find that very problematic. And is the reason those numbers have dropped is because you've had to put all of your personnel on the southern border to address the surge, which has not gotten better, and after 42 goes away, will probably get worse. And so where is the disconnect? As we have more people on the non-detention docket, as we have more orders of removal, but the people that we're removing seems to not really be increasing and has decreased dramatically from the high in 2019. Please explain to me, Director, why we are not doing a better job of interior enforcement, particularly of those individuals whose cases have played their way out through the justice system.
Really good questions. I think that the reason for the drop in removals are threefold. I think it does have something to do with our focus on the southwest border and us deploying a lot of staff to the southwest border to deal with the flow. We have certainly used our planes and assets and resources to expel a lot of those folks that were coming across, and that certainly impacted our ability to put Title VIII removals on those planes and in those seats as we've historically done. I also think that, as I mentioned previously, that the bulk of our removals come from our detention setting. It's obviously much easier to move someone when they're in your physical custody as
Well,
opposed to...
and that gets back to my whole argument of why are we reducing detention beds if it is easier to remove people in detention? And I know we talked about it, whether it's in the primary budget or the contingency budget, but it shouldn't be in the contingency budget. If it's easier to remove people once they're in detention, and you've agreed with that, and I agree with that, but yet we have a budget which is actually shrinking detention beds. I find that counterproductive, and I'm not trying to be argumentative. This is something I'm extremely passionate about. I know that you are, and you're passionate about making sure that you're representing the men and women that you serve with. But to see this budget request by this administration, and to see a decrease in detention beds at a time in which we see a spike in every other number, I find that hard to justify. And I'm not, and I don't place this blame solely on you. I know that you didn't get to write this this budget without input of others, but the detention beds are a key component of that. And at the rate that we're going, when we're removing 72,000 out of 1.2 million, that's less than 5% a year. And so it's going to take 20 years just to remove the people that we have orders on. And as these additional cases work their way through the system, we're going to see those numbers grow exponentially. And it just doesn't seem to me that we either don't have the resources or we don't have the policies in place to enforce the law. And that's all we're asking. We're just asking the law be enforced. If there's an order of removal, that person be removed. And we're not enforcing the law. And unfortunately, your agency has been tasked with enforcing the law, and we're not doing that. And so I'm very concerned about that. And I hope that you can explain to us what you need in the form of resources, what you need in the form of detention beds, what you need in the form of technology. What can we provide you so that you and your agents can do the job that you're tasked to do, because clearly you don't have the resources that you need. Clearly you don't have the manpower, you don't have the detention space, you don't have the technology. I mean, we just talked about the fact that we're allowing people in the country and we have no access to their criminal records from their country of origin. That's disturbing to me. It should be disturbing to all Americans that we're allowing people in the country and we have no idea what crimes they may have committed in their home country. And yet we're deciding whether those people are sent into detention, and we know they're very limited detention beds, or just released into the interior. And so what do you need from Congress? What do you need from us on the appropriation side that is going to allow you to enforce the law and do the job that you were created to do, you and your agency?
So as I mentioned, I think we definitely need additional officers and support staff to work the significant increase in the non-detained docket, which will probably double at the end of this year to close to 6 million if we were spitballing. I disagree. I don't think, as I've mentioned already, I think I do have access to those 9,000 beds. So in my mind, I think we're going to be, right around the 32 to 34,000 funding that we've historically had going into next fiscal year. And again, I'm hopeful that we'll actually be able to use beds like we have before COVID, where, when we started off in the beginning of the pandemic, we were only using 50% of our capacity because of social distancing requirement, all the mounds of litigation, and some of the the litigation and some of the social distancing requirements. Today, we're at like 73% of our bed capacity, our bed use. Hopefully on May 11, we can get to, the norm, which is typically around 88 to 93% of our capacity. So again, I think if that happens, you'll see more removals as a result of us just being able to use more of our detention capacity, and you won't see the Title 42 expulsions. There'll be all Title 8 removals. And I think we'll really be able to do an apples to apples comparison of where we were in 2019 compared to where we are now.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. Now recognize Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to follow up on Mr. Guest's line of questioning, earlier when I brought this issue up, you talked about, we're flying all these expulsions out and we don't have room for the others who have been adjudicated, that 1.2 million, that have orders to be deported, and we're not moving them. Yet we seem to have the ability to move everybody at the border to the interior of the country. If we've got the means to move people to the interior of the country, why can't we move them the other way and move them south, where most of them are coming from? I don't quite understand that. I want to ask you about an executive order that the president signed sometime back on law enforcement reform that is going to require agencies that partner with federal agencies to meet a whole lot of guidelines that actually came out of the George Floyd Justice Act. This is under Section 19 in the President's executive order. I know how much you rely on partnerships with state and local law enforcement. In fact, in your own written testimony, you mentioned the 4,000 task force officers that are helping you. I believe that this Section 19 is going to create a problem because many of these agencies are not going to be able to meet those Section 19 standards in that executive order. And according to the order, if they don't meet it, they're not going to be able to work with you. Are you aware that this is coming down the line?
I am sorry, Representative Rutherford, I am not tracking that, but
Okay.
I appreciate you bringing that to my.
Please look at that because I know how important these partnerships are. It's important to law enforcement that we partner with you all, not just on the illegal immigrants, but all of the criminal efforts that we have with HSI and all of that. So I just wanted to be sure you were aware of that. The other thing is, Arrow, you ran that. You know that program inside and out. As a sheriff, one of the things that I really appreciated was the 287G program that allowed, particularly, now I don't want to get into the police side of it, but the correction side of it, the jail-based program. Those folks have already been arrested. They are clearly the folks that we want to get out of our country. And so can you tell me how is that program working now? Are we encouraging agencies to become 287G, at least on the correction side, Can you talk a little bit about that? Are those numbers going up or down? Because I heard that we were not renewing contracts. Is that true?
So we have not increased the 287G agreements, but
Why not?
we have not eliminated any existing agreements either. So it's the program has sort of remained the status quo. When there was a commitment to take a look and do a review of the 287G program, and I think that's something that the department may continue to want to do
Director,
at some
from-
point. From my perspective, I think a totally functioning and appropriately running 287G program is the best thing since sliced bread. We with our workforce, the size of our workforce, they serve as a force multiplier. I'd much rather our officers go into a secure setting at a facility, assume custody of an individual rather than have to do an at-large arrest out in a community. So,
Exactly. And so let me ask, can you give me the numbers on whether that program is going up or down over the last several years, or particularly since the Biden administration? And why aren't we growing that program? I know there's got to be some agencies that want to participate in that. And from a public safety standpoint, I mean, you just said it. These are folks that we've already taken off the street. These are the easiest deportations you could possibly have. You don't have to go arrest them. They're already incarcerated.
So I will say again, the numbers haven't increased or decreased over the last 3 years. We can get you the exact numbers. I think just as there may be a few jurisdictions out there that may want to enter into an agreement, there's probably other jurisdictions out there that would actually have absolutely nothing to do with us, and nor would they want to enter into a 287G agreement. So I think it cuts both ways. I think we've just been on pause with entering into any new agreements until we figure out where folks might be headed on this thing.
And just very quickly, I know I'm out of time, but you think it's a great partnership?
I think anytime we can arrest someone in a secure location without putting our officers in danger of having to go out and arrest them out on the streets or in their
Right.
homes or at work, then it's obviously
Thank
a
you.
benefit for us.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sheriff. And for any of those questions that some of the members may have had that you were going to get back to them, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to try to have you get back to them within 15 business days from today. There may be additional questions that some of the members may have, and we'll provide them to you in writing and ask you to respond to those also in a timely manner. Again, I'd like to thank you for being here today and for the work that you do, and the subcommittee is adjourned.
Good job. Congrats on the first one.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
See you at,
Glad to see you at 2 o'clock. Glad to do it. Yes, they can't make this any tighter.
No,
we can't. Like sardines.
Sorry, yeah.
you gonna get me next, Shannon?
Yeah, I'll help you out.
Yeah.